Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise today to discuss the nomination of Norman Bay. President Obama has nominated Mr. Bay to be the commissioner, or a commissioner, of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. It's called FERC. The president had announced that if Mr. Bay is confirmed, that his plan is to elevate Mr. Bay to the position of chairman of FERC. Well, over the last few months, there have been much discussion about whether the president should have nominated Mr. Bay to be chairman, and I think there's very good reason for us to ask whether the president really should have nominated Mr. Bay at all. In my view, Mr. Bay is not qualified to be a commissioner, let alone to be chairman of FERC. Mr. Bay has only 5 years working in the energy sector, a total of 5 years. This is less time than the Keystone XL pipeline has been pending with the Obama administration. During the nomination hearing, I specifically asked Mr. Bay about his lack of experience. In response, he cited his summer internship at the Department of Energy Research Facility during college. A summer internship during college. With all due respect, this man does not have the background, the qualifications, and certainly experience to take on this important role. Now, the president has nominated Mr. Bay to replace the FERC's current chairman. Her name is Cheryl LaFleur. Now, in contrast to Mr. Bay, who the president has nominated to replace Ms. LaFleur, well, Ms. LaFleur has over 25 years of experience in the energy sector. That includes 4 years as the commissioner of FERC and 7 months as the chairman of FERC. Now, I don't often agree with Ms. LaFleur's policies, but you cannot deny that she is qualified to serve. Mr. Bay's lack of experience is not the only reason that I oppose his nomination. There are a number of outstanding factual disputes about Mr. Bay's tenure as the FERC's enforcement director. For example, there are serious allegations that the enforcement staff, during the time that Mr. Bay has been in charge, has violated basic principles of due process. These allegations include the withholding of exculpatory evidence from subjects of FERC investigations. In May, the Energy Law Journal published an article by William Sherman, who's a former general counsel of FERC, and by 2 other attorneys familiar with the situation, and they write, there is a widespread view that the FERC enforcement process has become lopsided and unfair. They said that one need only to observe the fact that enforcement staff denies in case after case the existence of exculpatory or exonerating materials, only to produce a subset of those materials too late in the process to be of use in raising defenses. The authors explain that one of the fundamental principles of due process is that the government is not permitted to hide information from the accused that may aid in his or her defense. They say FERC enforcement staff routinely fails to produce the exculpatory documents, routinely fails to produce the documents. During Mr. Bay's nominating hearing, I asked him about these allegations. At first, he denied that the allegations were true, but then he stated that he was, quote, not aware of any instance in which enforcement staff had failed to produce the materials. So I asked him to clarify his remarks. I asked him whether the allegations were true or not. He pled ignorance. With all due respect, his answer is inexcusable. This is his staff doing his work under his direction. He should know whether or not they withheld the evidence from defendants. Now, there are not only questions about his commitment to due process, there are also questions about the president's nominee on whether or someone else at FERC suggested that an enforcement action be settled in return for approval of a merger. So there's questions about whether an enforcement action should be settled in return for approving a merger. The ranking member of the Energy Committee asked all about this during the nomination hearing. The ranking member of the committee asked Mr. Bay about the connection between FERC's enforcement settlement with Constellation Energy and FERC's approval of Constellation's merger with Exelon. The ranking member noted that FERC settled with Constellation the day before, one day before it approved a merger between Constellation and Exelon. In fact, the enforcement settlement, which Mr. Bay himself signed, specifically mentions the merger between these two. The ranking member of the Energy Committee asked Mr. Bay whether he is concerned about the appearance of a quid pro quo between the settlement agreement one day, the merger approval the next. Now, he admitted he would be concerned. The ranking member then asked if he or others at FERC suggested to Constellation that it should settle the enforcement action in order to get its merger approved. In response, he said, well, to the best of his recollection, he didn't make such a suggestion, and that he did not know what others at FERC, including his own staff, may have suggested. With all due respect to Mr. Bay, his answer is at best hard to believe. At the time, FERC's enforcement settlement with Constellation was the largest enforcement settlement in the history of the agency completely. So they make this settlement. It is the largest enforcement settlement in the agency's history. And the next day, they allow a merger which has created one of the nation's largest utilities. Are we really to believe that Mr. Bay doesn't remember what he or others at FERC said to Constellation? Can we really believe that? Now, I believe the Energy Committee or some other independent entity should get answers to these and to other questions surrounding Mr. Bay's record before we decide this Senate to confirm him and promote him. Now, I know that some Senate Democrats are nervous about voting for Mr. Bay, and I believe rightfully so. These Senate Democrats have said they will vote for Mr. Bay only because they believe that a deal was cut, or a so-called deal was cut, with President Obama specifically. They say the president will allow Ms. LaFleur to continue serving as chairman for 9 months after her confirmation. The president hasn't put it in writing, hasn't really told all of the members that. And even if the president had, this is no way for the Senate to be able to enforce it. The truth is, this is a gimmick. And it's a gimmick invented specifically by Senate Democrats so they can once again avoid standing up to President Obama and the Senate Majority Leader. Now, let's be clear what President Obama is asking the Senate to do. The President is asking the Senate to demote Cheryl LaFleur, demote her from being chairman. She's a highly qualified woman, a Democrat with over 25 years of experience in energy, 4 years of experience as commissioner of the FERC, in order to promote an unqualified man. Why should the Senate do this? Well, the Senate Majority Leader put it this way in the Wall Street Journal. He said, I don't want her. He said, I don't want her as chair. He said, she has done some stuff to do away with some of Wellinghoff's stuff. It's the Majority Leader of the United States Senate. I don't want her, he said, as chair. In short, the President and the Majority Leader want a rubber stamp. By all indications, they will get that with Mr. Bay. On May 20th, during his confirmation hearing, Mr. Bay admitted that he wasn't even following EPA regulations and their impact to electric reliability in this country. 2 weeks later, on June 4th, in response to written questions, he stated the EPA's regulations are, quote, manageable. Well, either he's an exceptionally quick study or he doesn't take electric reliability seriously. FERC is an independent agency. It needs a highly qualified leader, a leader whose record is beyond reproach, a leader who will resist political interference from the White House and the Majority Leader, and Mr. Bay is not that individual. For these reasons, I'm voting against Mr. Bay and urge all members to do the same. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of a quorum.